They said the forest had eyes, that anyone who dared walk too deep into Koumbia never came back. Not because they were killed, but because they were changed. The elders whispered it in hushed tones around evening fires, their weathered faces etched, with the kind of reverence reserved for truths too dangerous to speak aloud. But what if a president vanished into that cursed forest alone, with no guards, and emerged with a miracle clasped in his trembling hand? This is not a legend. This happened. And it all began with a prayer no one heard except something ancient, buried beneath the soil of a dying land. The cameras had been shut off hours ago. The ministers had shuffled home to their air-conditioned compounds, their bellies full of imported wine and promises they had no intention of keeping. The reporters had already moved on to their next headlines. Another scandal, another border dispute, another excuse to avoid the deeper wounds that festered beneath Burkina Faso's sun-baked surface. But Ibrahim Traoré, president, soldier, and son of the Sahel, did not return to his gilded quarters in the palace. The weight of the day's meetings still pressed against his chest like stones. He had sat through 4 hours of budget discussions where officials debated the cost of medicine, while children died 30 kilometers away. He had listened to foreign investors explain why clean water infrastructure wasn't economically viable, while their own pipelines drained the Earth's blood for distant shores. Under the cover of darkness, he stripped away the uniform that had once meant everything to him. The medals, the insignia, the carefully pressed fabric that separated him from his people, all of it fell to the floor like shed skin. He folded his presidential identification card and tucked it beneath a clay jar his grandmother had made, a vessel that had survived droughts, coups, and decades of broken promises. Tonight, he would not be a president. Tonight, he would simply be a man seeking answers in a land that had forgotten how to hope. There was no convoy, no sirens wailing through empty streets, no security detail briefed on his movements. Just a lone jeep, engine coughing like an old man with dust in his lungs, rattling toward the forgotten edges of his nation. The headlights carved through darkness thick as velvet, illuminating patches of scrubland where nothing grew except thorns and the bones of animals that had searched for water and found only sand. Ibrahim drove through the night with his windows down, breathing in the raw scent of his homeland, dry earth, distant smoke, and something else, something older. The smell of a place where spirits once walked freely before borders were drawn by foreign hands, before the earth was carved up and sold to the highest bidder. Somewhere in these forgotten folds of his nation, children were dying from thirst beside rivers poisoned by foreign mines. Mothers knelt over empty cooking pots while oil pipelines carried wealth to continents that had never felt the Sahel's burning wind, and no amount of speeches delivered from marble podiums could silence the guilt that crawled beneath his skin. Like insects seeking warmth, he had to see it, feel it, smell the dust of his own failure. He arrived at the village of Lumbila just after dusk, when the sky bled orange and purple like an infected wound. There were no streetlights here, no electrical hum of progress, only the flicker of firewood and the acrid stench of fever that hung in the air like incense burned for gods who had stopped listening. The first thing he saw was a girl, no more than 8 years old, crouched beside a broken water pipe. Her small hands worked frantically at the rusted valve, turning it again and again with the desperate persistence of someone who had never learned to accept defeat. Nothing came out but a hollow hiss, the sound of empty promises echoing through. Metal bones. Ibrahim watched her for a long moment, his heart constricting. She wore a dress that had once been blue but had faded to the color of forgotten sky. Her feet were bare, caked with the kind of dust that never fully washes away. When she finally looked up and saw him standing there, she didn't run or hide. She simply stared with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. "The water stopped 3 weeks ago," she said matter-of-factly, as if explaining why the sun rises in the east. Mama says it will come back when God remembers us." "And what do you think?" Ibrahim asked, crouching down to meet her gaze. The girl tilted her head, studying him with the careful attention of someone who had learned that adults' words often meant less than their shadows. "I think God is busy with other people's prayers." The clinic was a windowless concrete box at the village's heart, its walls stained by time and desperation. The paint had peeled away like dead skin, revealing the raw bones of construction that had been hurried, cheap, insufficient from the very beginning. A hand-painted sign hung crooked above the entrance, Centre de Santé Lumbila, but the letters had faded until they looked more like scars than words. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic taste of sickness and the sharp bite of disinfectant that couldn't quite mask the smell of bodies fighting battles they were destined to lose. Two patients shared a single bed, a man with malaria-bright eyes, and a woman whose cough sounded like paper tearing. In the corner, a boy no older than 12 lay on a mat, his small frame convulsing with a fever that made his teeth chatter like broken glass. A nurse, barely out of her teens, moved between, them with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to stretch hope across impossible distances. She had no medicine to offer, only cool cloths and whispered prayers in a language that predated the borders drawn on colonial maps. "I'm looking for the doctor," Ibrahim said quietly, his voice barely louder than the boy's labored breathing. She didn't even glance at him, too focused on adjusting the cloth on the child's burning forehead. "You're looking too late. Dr. Sawadogo died 6 months ago. Stroke. We've been waiting for a replacement ever since." "Who's treating the patients?" Now she looked at him, and he saw exhaustion carved into features that should have been bright with youth. "God," she said simply, "and whatever I remember from 2 years of nursing school." Ibrahim stood in the doorway, watching her work with supplies that wouldn't have been adequate for a veterinary clinic in the capital. This was his nation. These were his people. And he, with all his power, all his titles, all his carefully worded speeches about progress and hope, was standing useless while children fought for their lives with nothing but prayer and the stubborn determination of a teenage nurse who refused to surrender. The boy whimpered, his tiny fingers curled into fists so tight that his knuckles had gone white. The president of a nation, a trained soldier who had seen battle and buried friends, felt more helpless than he ever had while bullets whistled past his head. That night, he slept on the floor of a hut offered by a blind woman named Fatou. She was ancient, her face mapped with wrinkles that told stories of droughts survived and children buried. Her eyes had gone milky with cataracts, but she moved through her small space with the confidence of someone who saw with more than vision. She didn't know who he was, couldn't see the expensive watch he'd forgotten to remove, couldn't recognize the face that appeared on television screens and campaign posters. She knew only that a man had come alone to her village, that he was tired, and that he carried a sadness heavy enough to bend his shoulders. She gave him soup made from vegetables. She had grown herself and space on her floor beside a fire that burned low and steady. The soup was thin but warm, seasoned with herbs that tasted like the earth itself. Bitter, honest, real. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried the weight of someone who had watched the world change and learned to find meaning in what remained constant. "The young ones," she said, stirring the coals with a stick worn smooth by decades of use, "they think the forest is evil. They think Koumbia takes people because it's hungry for blood." "What do you think?" Ibrahim asked, grateful for conversation that didn't require him to lie about who he was. Fatou smiled, revealing teeth like old ivory. "I think the forest takes only what people bring to it. Fear brings monsters. Greed brings emptiness. But sometimes—" She paused, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "Sometimes a man brings truth and the forest gives truth back." He could not sleep. Despite his exhaustion, despite the warmth of Fatu's simple kindness, sleep remained elusive. He sat cross-legged in the dark beside the dying fire, watching shadows dance across the mud-brick walls. The flame flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting light that made everything seem fragile and temporary. The dirt beneath his feet was cracked and warm, still holding the day's heat like a memory that refused to fade. He removed his boots, expensive, leather things that had been crafted in Italy and felt suddenly obscene in this place of honest poverty, and pressed his palms flat against the earth. The soil was alive beneath his hands, not just with insects and roots, but with something deeper, something that pulsed with the rhythm of a heart too vast to comprehend. He could feel the network of life spreading beneath him, the underground rivers that had run dry, the seeds, waiting for rain that might never come, the bones of animals and ancestors feeding the dirt that would, in turn, feed whatever managed to grow. And in that moment, surrounded by the breathing darkness of a village where hope had learned to survive on scraps, Ibrahim Traoré did something he had not done since he was a child, kneeling beside his mother's bed. He prayed. Not the formal prayers of state ceremonies, not the careful words crafted for diplomatic occasions, but the raw, desperate prayer of a man who had run out of other options. His voice was barely a whisper, lost in the soft crackling of cooling coals and the distant cry of night birds. "If there is still a guardian spirit in this land," he began, his fingers digging into the warm earth, "if anything ancient still watches over us, don't save me. I've had my chances. I've worn the uniform, spoken the words, signed the papers. Save them!" His voice cracked like clay in drought. "The children in that clinic, the girl at the broken pipe, the mothers who pray over empty pots. If that is not possible, then show me what must be done. Show me how to be worthy of their trust." The flame died, as if his words had blown it out, and something else answered. The wind was no longer wind. It had become breath. Deep, measured, ancient. It moved through the trees surrounding the village like the exhalation of something vast and patient that had been holding its breath for centuries. Not loud, not cold, but unmistakably alive, as if the forest itself had begun to inhale and exhale with the rhythm of a sleeping giant. Ibrahim Traoré stood outside Fatu's hut, his bare feet sinking slightly into dust that seemed softer now, more yielding. The air had changed in ways that made his skin prickle with electricity. No dogs barked their usual chorus at strange sounds. No insects hummed their nightly symphony. Even the night birds had fallen silent. The world had stilled, holding its breath with him, waiting. He didn't wait for dawn. Fatu had given him a machete, old, but sharp, its handle worn smooth by generations of hands that had cleared paths through wilderness. His flashlight hung heavy in his other hand, though something told him it would not serve him long where he was going. He followed the wind deeper into the grasslands that bordered Koumbia, through stalks that rose higher than his head, and whispered secrets in languages that had no words. The trail, if it could be called a trail, twisted through corridors of vegetation that seemed to part before him and close behind him, as if the earth itself was guiding his steps toward something inevitable. The edge of Koumbia forest loomed ahead like a wall of living shadow. Even in the darkness, he could feel its presence. Ancient trees that had stood sentinel long before the first European boots had touched African soil, before the first borders had been carved into the continent's flesh with rulers and rifles. The elders called it the lungs of the ancestors, the place where the spirits of the land breathed life into the world. The military called it cursed, forbidden territory, marked on no maps and avoided by satellite surveillance. There were no paths here, no GPS coordinates, just legends passed down through generations, and the kind of silence that made men speak in whispers. But Traoré wasn't looking for a trail. He was looking for the thing that had answered his prayer. Branches scraped his arms as he pushed deeper into the forest, their thorns catching at his simple clothes and drawing thin lines of blood that he barely noticed. The farther he walked, the heavier the air became, thick and humid, like breathing inside lungs instead of open sky. His flashlight flickered once, twice, then died with a final defeated wheeze. He didn't curse the darkness or fumble for spare batteries. He simply kept walking, guided by something that had nothing to do with sight. The ground beneath his feet began to change. What had been hard-packed earth became soft, almost spongy, as if he were walking on the surface of something that lived and breathed. Something beneath the soil pulsed faintly. Not a sound he could hear, but a vibration he felt in his bones, in the marrow, in the spaces between his ribs where fear and wonder wrestled for dominance. His foot landed on roots so thick they felt like buried ribs, the skeletal remains of giants who had fallen and become the foundation for new life. All around him the forest seemed to tighten its embrace. Branches curved downward like protective arms. Vines tangled like nervous fingers reaching out to touch him, to test him, to judge whether he belonged in this sacred space. The sound of the world, wind through leaves, the scurry of small animals, the distant calls of night hunters, began to draw inward, as if the entire forest had turned its attention to the small, sweating man who had dared to enter its heart without permission or protection. And then he heard it. A sound so low it seemed to rise from beneath the earth itself, from the molten core of the world, a groan that carried the weight of geological time, not human, not beast, but heavy with age and sorrow that spanned millennia. It was the sound of tectonic plates shifting, of mountains being born, of things so old that they remembered when the Sahara was green and rivers flowed where now only sand remained. Ibrahim stopped walking. His body tensed like a wire stretched. To breaking point, every muscle coiled with the primitive awareness that he had stepped into the presence of something far greater and more dangerous than himself. The groan came again, closer now, deeper, vibrating through the soles of his feet and up into his chest cavity. He could feel it in his teeth, in the spaces between his vertebrae, in the hollow places where courage was supposed to live. He pushed through a curtain of moss that hung like ancient tapestry, soft and damp with moisture that tasted of secrets. Beyond it lay a clearing that shouldn't have existed, a perfect circle of open space in the heart of impenetrable forest, as if the trees themselves had stepped back in deference to what dwelt here. At the center of the clearing stood a baobab, tree so massive it defied comprehension. Its trunk was wide enough to house a village, its bark scarred and weathered by centuries of storms that had been forgotten by human memory. The tree seemed to pulse with its own life force, roots spreading out like the fingers of a sleeping god, disappearing into soil that glowed faintly with bioluminescent fungi, and coiled around the base of this ancient giant, trapped beneath a collapsed tangle of wood and root thick enough to crush steel, lay something that existed in the space between myth and reality. A serpent. Colossal beyond measure, its body thick as tree trunks, scales black as volcanic glass, but veined with gold that shimmered like dying embers. The metallic patterns flowed across its hide like liquid starlight, dim but undeniably alive, breathing with the slow rhythm of geological time. The creature was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Its middle section was pinned beneath a fallen branch that must have weighed tons, a piece of the great baobab itself, gnarled and ancient, its wood harder than iron and rooted so deep into the forest floor that it seemed to have grown there, specifically to imprison this being. But what stopped Ibrahim's breath in his throat were the eyes. The serpent didn't thrash against its bonds. It didn't hiss or strike or show any of the fury that might be expected from a creature in such circumstances. It simply lay there, watching him with eyes like molten gold, oval and ancient, containing depths that reflected not just light but time itself. These were not the eyes of an animal driven by instinct and hunger. These were the eyes of something that remembered when the first humans had walked upright, when the great rivers had carved their paths through virgin stone, when the world was young and magic flowed as freely as water. The serpent blinked slowly, solemnly, with the patience of something that had been waiting longer than empires had existed. Ibrahim's breath caught in his chest. His fingers tightened around the machete's handle, not from any intention to attack, but from the purely human need to hold something real and solid when faced with the impossible. Every story from his childhood screamed in his head. Tales his grandmother had told him about forest spirits that stole men's souls, about creatures that lured the unwary with promises of power, only to devour them whole. Leave. The rational part of his mind commanded. Run. Don't look into its eyes. This is how men disappear and are never found. But his feet betrayed him. Instead of turning away, instead of fleeing back toward the safety of the human world, he stepped forward. I came looking for a sign, he whispered, unsure why he spoke. Aloud. Unsure if the words were meant for the serpent or for whatever force had guided him to this place. The serpent blinked again. A gesture so deliberate it felt like a response, like acknowledgement, like the beginning of a conversation that would change everything. Ibrahim studied the massive branch that pinned the creature's body to the earth. It was more than wood. It was a living cage, its surface pulsing faintly with the same bioluminescent patterns that veined the serpent's scales. The root system had grown through and around the serpent's coils, creating a prison that seemed almost organic, as if the forest itself had conspired to hold this being in place. But why? What crime could a creature of such obvious power have? Committed to warrant such imprisonment? Or was this not punishment but protection, keeping something too dangerous for the modern world safely contained? The questions multiplied in his mind, but looking into those ancient golden eyes, Ibrahim felt something shift inside his chest. This was not a monster. This was a guardian, trapped and forgotten, left to watch over a land that had lost its way. He dropped to one knee, pressed his palms flat against the earth surrounding the fallen branch. The soil was warm here, almost feverish, as if infected by proximity to something divine. He could feel the pulse more clearly now, not just vibration, but rhythm, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Ibrahim braced his shoulder against the gnarled wood. The surface was rough against his skin, bark that felt more like stone than anything that had ever been alive. He didn't count to 3. He didn't offer a preliminary prayer. He simply pushed, with every ounce of strength in his body. The earth fought back. His boots slipped in soil that seemed to grab at his feet like quicksand. Sweat poured down his spine, soaking through his shirt and mixing with the blood from where thorns had scratched his arms. His muscles screamed protests that he ignored, driven by something deeper than determination. The branch didn't budge, not even a tremor. Ibrahim repositioned himself, digging his heels deeper into the dirt, changing his angle of attack. Still, nothing. The wood might as well have been fused with the earth's core, unmovable as a mountain. But as he strained against the impossible weight, memories flooded through him. The girl at the broken pipe, turning the useless valve with fingers, that refused to accept defeat. The teenage nurse treating malaria with prayers because she had no medicine. Faso, giving soup to a stranger because kindness was the only wealth she possessed. And deeper memories. His own childhood in a village much like this one, watching his mother boil grass to make soup when there was nothing else to eat. The night. His younger sister died from an infection that could have been cured with antibiotics that cost less than a politician's lunch. The moment he had sworn to become strong enough, powerful enough, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, he had failed them all. The realization broke something open inside him, and from that broken place came a sound he didn't recognize, as his own voice. Not a scream of anger or frustration, but something deeper. A roar from the belly of his spirit, from the boy who had grown up with empty plates, from the soldier who had buried his brothers, from the president who watched babies die in clinics that lacked basic supplies. He pushed again. This time, the branch groaned. The serpent remained perfectly still, but its golden eyes seemed to brighten, as if reflecting some inner fire that had been kindled by Ibrahim's determination. Ibrahim changed his approach, working his hands under the branch's edge, using leverage instead of brute force. His back bent at an angle that sent lightning up his spine. His arms trembled with strain, but he felt something give, not the wood itself, but the earth that held it. Sweat dripped into his eyes, blurring his vision, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, because this was no longer about moving a branch or freeing a mythical creature. This was about proving to himself that he was still capable of action, that his hands could do more than sign papers and shake hands with people who saw his nation as nothing more than a resource to be extracted. With a crack that sounded like thunder, the branch split, not broken, but separated along a natural fault line that seemed to have been waiting for exactly the right amount of pressure applied in exactly the right way. The serpent slid free with liquid grace, its massive body, rippling with power that had been compressed and contained for far too long. Ibrahim stumbled backward, chest heaving, clothes soaked with sweat and dirt, and the effort of doing something that mattered. The creature rose slowly, its coils spiraling upward until its head towered above him, higher than the hut where Faso slept, higher than any structure in Koumbia. Its scales caught the faint starlight filtering through the canopy, creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow like oil on water. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the world held its breath. No night sounds, no wind through leaves, no heartbeat except the thunderous pulse of the serpent's ancient blood. Just the weight of a gaze that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of languages, the slow transformation of a green world into desert. And then it spoke. Not with lips or tongue, but with a voice that resonated inside. Ibrahim's bones, in the spaces between his thoughts, in the part of his mind that still remembered what it felt like to be small and vulnerable and dependent on forces beyond human control. "You are not what I expected," the voice said, each word falling like drops of molten gold into the silence. Ibrahim remained silent, not from fear, but from the profound recognition that he stood in the presence of something deserving reverence, something that predated human language and would outlast human civilization. "You came into my pain, not to kill, not to conquer, but to free." The serpent's head tilted, studying him with the careful attention of a scholar examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Long have I waited for a man who would act without desire for reward, a man who would suffer for strangers, a man whose heart bleeds louder than his voice." A single scale shimmered loose from beneath the creature's magnificent chin. It floated down with impossible slowness, weightless as a feather but glowing with internal light, like a piece of trapped sunlight. It landed softly at Ibrahim's feet, warm against the cooling earth. "A gift," the serpent said, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Ibrahim's chest cavity. "Not of gold, but of consequence. Not of power, but of responsibility." Ibrahim knelt and reached for the scale with trembling fingers. The moment his skin made contact, warmth flooded through him. Not heat, but the kind of warmth that came from being recognized, being seen, being judged worthy by something that did not give such judgments lightly. The scale pulsed in his palm, like a living heart, sending whispers through his bloodstream that he couldn't quite understand but felt in his very marrow. Images flashed behind his eyes, rivers running clean, children laughing in schoolyards, fields green with crops that grew in soil once thought dead. but with the visions came a warning that made his spine straighten with sudden dread. "Know this," the voice rumbled deeper now, carrying the weight of prophecy and threat in equal measure. "What is given freely can be taken freely. The gift I give responds to the heart that holds it. Use it with wisdom, and it will multiply blessings beyond counting. Use it with greed, and it will consume everything you touch, everyone you claim to love." The serpent's massive body began to move, uncoiling with hypnotic grace. Each movement sent ripples through the earth, as if the creature were connected to the very foundations of the world. Remember this, Ibrahim of Burkina Faso. Remember when ambitious men come seeking what they did not earn, when those who would rule through fear discover that power has returned to one who rules through service. They will try to take what you carry. And when they do, the golden eyes blazed brighter. The forest will remember what justice means. The serpent's form began to change, its solid mass becoming translucent, then ethereal. It unraveled in coils of smoke and shadow, melting into the baobab's bark, seeping into the soil, dissolving into the air itself, as if it had never been anything more than a dream of desperate men. But the scale remained real and warm in Ibrahim's hand, proof that some prayers are answered in ways that defy every law except the law of consequence. Ibrahim. Traoré remained kneeling in the clearing long after the serpent had vanished, the golden scale burning gentle fire in his palm. The forest slowly exhaled around him, releasing the held breath of centuries. Wind returned to the leaves. Night sounds crept back like timid children. The world began to turn again. When he finally stood, his legs shook not from exhaustion, but from the weight of understanding that his life had just divided into before and after, that he carried something that would change not just his fate, but the fate of everyone his choices would touch. He walked out of Koumbia as the sun painted the horizon in shades of hope and warning. The forest released him gradually, branches parting, like curtains, roots smoothing their surface to ease his passage. Birds dared to sing again, their voices tentative at first, then growing bolder as they realized the forest's ancient business had been concluded. The golden scale pulsed against his chest where he had tucked it inside his shirt, warm against. His heart reminding him with each beat that he carried something precious and dangerous in equal measure. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when Ibrahim returned to Lumbila, but the village had already begun to transform in ways that defied rational explanation. The changes were subtle at first, the kind of small miracles that could be dismissed as coincidence by those who preferred their world bounded by scientific law. The children who had been coughing blood in the clinic woke with color in their cheeks. Their fevers had broken in the night, and they sat up asking for water with voices clear as morning air. The well behind the school, which had been nothing but a hole filled with dust and disappointment for months, began to bubble with water so pure it carried no taste except the memory of underground rivers. The liquid rose without pumps or pressure, flowing as if the earth itself had decided to share its hidden treasures. Chickens that hadn't laid eggs in weeks suddenly produced clutches of perfect white spheres. Gardens that had yielded nothing but withered stems burst into bloom overnight. A tree that local botanists had declared permanently barren flowered white as fresh cotton, filling the air with fragrance that made children laugh for no reason, except joy. The villagers noticed immediately, of course. In a place where survival depended on paying attention to every small change in fortune, miracles didn't go unobserved. They whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of blessings that had arrived without explanation or apparent cause. But they also noticed the young man who had come alone in the night, who had slept on Fatu's floor, who had asked about the sick and spoken no word of his own importance or authority. Some recognized something familiar in his face. A photograph glimpsed on a distant television, a campaign poster weathered by rain and sun. But they spoke of him not as a politician, but as something else, something more immediate and real. They called him the one who walked into the forest. An elderly woman knelt and wept at his feet when she found him sitting beside the restored well, tears of gratitude falling onto soil that seemed more fertile with each drop. A hunter who had tracked him silently through the streets saluted him, with the respect reserved for warriors who had proven themselves in ways that had nothing to do with rank or title. The blind woman, Faso, somehow found him as he prepared to leave. She pressed a small wooden carving into his hands, a serpent, but not threatening. This one was smiling, if serpents could smile, its coils arranged in patterns that suggested protection rather than danger. For remembering that some powers are earned through service, she said simply, as if she had always known exactly who he was and why he had come. By the time Ibrahim returned to the capital, news of the miracles in Koumbia had already begun to spread through the informal networks. That connected village to village faster than any modern communication system. It traveled through market gossip, through the songs of traveling musicians, through the prayers of rural imams who spoke of divine intervention in their Friday sermons. The golden scale remained hidden beneath his shirt, but its influence radiated outward like ripples on a pond. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Generals who had once ignored his calls now stood when he entered the room. Ministers who had muttered behind closed doors about his naive idealism began to quote his speeches in their own public appearances. Foreign diplomats studied him with new wariness, as if they sensed something fundamental had shifted but couldn't identify what. In private communications intercepted by intelligence services, several described him as changed, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous to established interests. Ibrahim didn't use the scale, not as a weapon, not as a charm, not as a tool for political manipulation. He simply placed it inside a carved wooden box in the corner of his private quarters, behind an old photograph of his mother. But the land itself seemed to respond to its presence. International aid that had been tied up in bureaucratic red tape for years suddenly flowed freely. Development projects that had been stalled by corruption and incompetence found new life, and honest administrators. Investment that had been redirected to more stable nations began to return, drawn by reports of unprecedented peace and productivity. Schools that had been closed for lack of funding reopened with new teachers and supplies that appeared as if materialized from thin air. Hospitals received shipments of medicine from donors who wished to remain anonymous. Infrastructure projects that had been frozen by political gridlock were suddenly greenlit with almost magical efficiency. Farmers claimed their soil was richer, that seeds planted in ground that had been barren for years now sprouted with unprecedented vigor. Cattle that had been dying in the heat grew fat and healthy. Even the weather seemed to cooperate. Rains came when needed, drought lifted when it had overstayed its welcome. The people called it the blessing, and they spoke Ibrahim's name with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints and prophets. But power, even divine power, is never silent for long. In a marble hall in the north wing of the capital, behind doors gilded by long-dead colonizers and preserved by the kind of bureaucracy that valued procedure over progress, a man named General Koumbia watched the evening news with lips pressed tight as wire and eyes that burned with the specific fury of someone watching his relevance evaporate in real time. Koumbia had once been the lion of the old regime, respected by those who mattered, feared by those who didn't, seemingly untouchable in his web of influence and intimidation. He had dined with oil executives in restaurants that cost more than most villagers earned in a year, signed deals that turned pristine rivers into industrial sewers, and maintained his position through a careful balance of corruption and violence that had kept him powerful for over a decade. He had survived 3 different presidents, outlasted 2 coups, and weathered every political storm by ensuring that he remained indispensable to anyone who wanted to rule effectively. His network of allies, informants, and obligated officials had made him the real power behind every throne, the man who decided which policies would succeed and which would die in committee. And now, he was invisible. Nobody asked for his advice anymore. Nobody invited him to briefings. His phone, once constantly ringing with calls from people seeking his influence, sat silent on his desk like an expensive paperweight. All because of a story, a myth, a fairy tale about a president who walked into a cursed forest and emerged with divine favor. He smashed his wine glass against the marble wall, watching expensive burgundy stain the pristine white surface like blood. Magic, he scoffed, his voice echoing in chambers that had once hosted the continent's most powerful men. Fairy tales for fools who believe in spirits and forest gods. But even as he spoke the words, Condé didn't believe them. Not really. Because he had seen the photographs circulating through diplomatic channels, the blooming trees, the flowing wells, the children whose medical files documented impossible recoveries. He had read the economic reports showing unprecedented stability and growth in regions that had been considered hopeless just months before, and he had heard, through carefully cultivated sources inside the presidential security detail, about the box. The wooden box in Traoré's quarters, hidden behind his mother's photograph, containing something that glowed with its own light. If there was truly something supernatural at work, some artifact of power that commanded the loyalty of both spirits and citizens, then Condé needed it for himself. Not because he believed in its divine origin, but because the people did. And in politics, belief was the only currency that truly mattered. He had built his career on understanding that perception shaped reality more than facts ever could. If Traoré possessed a symbol that people viewed as evidence of divine favor, then stealing that symbol would mean stealing the heart of the people's faith. Without their belief in his blessed status, Traoré would become just another politician making promises he couldn't keep. Condé spent 3 days planning his theft with the same meticulous attention he had once devoted to organizing coups. He studied guard rotations, identified security vulnerabilities, and cultivated the specific corruption required to ensure certain cameras would malfunction at crucial moments. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was planning to steal a blessing, to take by force what was supposed to have been granted through divine grace. But Condé had never believed in grace. He believed in leverage, in opportunity, in the simple truth that powerful men took what they wanted from those too weak to protect it. The night chosen for his mission was moonless, the sky black as coal tar and just as suffocating. Condé moved through the palace corridors like a shadow returning to familiar darkness. These halls had once been his domain. He knew every corner where cameras couldn't see, every guard who could be bought or intimidated, every weakness in a security system he had helped design. The cameras were off, their feeds looping footage from the previous night thanks to a technician whose gambling debts had made him unexpectedly cooperative. The guards remained at their posts, but their attention had been directed elsewhere by reports of suspicious activity in the Eastern District, reports that Condé himself had arranged through channels that couldn't be traced back to him. The door to Traoré's private quarters was unlocked, a detail that should have seemed suspicious, but instead felt like confirmation of divine favor working in his direction. Too easy, perhaps, but Condé had never been one to question good fortune when it aligned with his objectives. Inside, the air was still and heavy, carrying the faint scent of sandalwood incense and something else, something wild and green that reminded him uncomfortably of forest depths and growing things. A single candle burned near the desk, its flame steady despite the complete absence of any breeze. The room was spartanly furnished, lacking the golden fixtures and imported luxuries that Condé would have expected from a head of state. Maps of the nation covered one wall, marked with small pins in villages that most politicians couldn't locate on their best day. The desk held a half-written letter to a rural school teacher, thanking her for raising young minds with courage in their hearts and questions on their tongues. And in the corner, exactly where his informant had promised it would be, sat the box. It was smaller than he had expected, plain wood carved with patterns that looked almost organic, as if the designs had grown rather than been etched. The box seemed to pulse faintly with its own rhythm, and when he placed his hands on its lid, the wood was warm to the touch. He opened it with the careful reverence of someone handling explosive material. There it was, the golden scale, no larger than his palm but radiating presence like a miniature sun. It hummed faintly with harmonics that seemed to vibrate in his teeth, and its surface swirled with patterns that made his eyes water when he tried to focus on them directly. His fingers closed around it, and the sensation was immediate and overwhelming. The scale seared his palm like molten metal, but the pain came paired with something else, a rush of power that flooded through his nervous system like electric current, making every nerve ending sing with potential. He gasped, but didn't let go. Power was never supposed to feel comfortable. Power was supposed to burn, to demand sacrifice, to exact a price from those who wielded it. The pain was proof that what he held was real, that the stories were true, that he now possessed the source of Traoré's miraculous transformations. He slipped the scale into his coat pocket, where it continued to pulse against his ribs like a second heartbeat. As he turned to leave, he caught his reflection in the dark window and smiled. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, he would be the one whom people called blessed. But the forest had already awakened to his theft. As Kande drove through the empty streets of the capital, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, something fundamental shifted in the world around him. The stolen scale burned against his chest like a coal that refused to cool, its pulse now irregular, agitated, angry. The wind began to howl, not across the plains as was natural, but through them, as if some massive force was drawing breath from beneath the earth itself. Trees that had stood straight for decades now leaned away from his headlights, their branches reaching towards something in the distance that called to them with voices older than human language. Birds flew in strange formations, spiraling patterns that made no sense according to any natural migration or feeding behavior. They seemed to be fleeing something, or perhaps surrounding it, their cries sharp with warning calls that made Kande's skin crawl with primitive anxiety. He pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to reach the forest before dawn. Before whatever forces he had awakened could organize themselves against him. The engine whined in protest, but the car responded, hurtling through landscape that seemed increasingly alien with each passing kilometer. When he reached the edge of Koumbia, the forest was waiting for him. Not passively, the way forests usually wait, with the patient indifference of plant life that marks time in decades rather than heartbeats. This forest thrummed with awareness, its trees swaying in rhythms that had nothing to do with wind patterns, its shadows shifting in ways that suggested massive movement in the depths between the trunks. Kande left his car running, engine idling like a nervous animal ready to bolt. He walked toward the same baobab tree that had witnessed Traoré's transformation, guided not by memory or compass, but by something that felt uncomfortably like compulsion. The path that should have taken hours to navigate opened before him in minutes, as if the forest itself was eager to deliver him to his destination. Branches parted without his needing to cut them. Roots that should have tangled his feet smoothed themselves into stepping stones. Even the darkness seemed to retreat, revealing clearings and passages that hadn't existed during his reconnaissance. He reached the sacred clearing in what felt like moments, though his watch insisted that hours had passed. Time moved differently here, governed by rules that predated human measurement and would outlast human understanding. The baobab tree stood as magnificent and terrible as ever, but now the ground around its base pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that made the earth look like living flesh, veined with arteries of light that carried some form of divine circulation. "I have what's mine!" Kande shouted into the breathing darkness, his voice cracking with a mixture of bravado and barely suppressed terror. "You gave it to him, but I'm the one who deserves it. I've bled for this country. I've ruled it. I've sacrificed everything to keep it stable and strong." No response came from the trees or the glowing earth. Only silence that felt heavy with judgment. He pulled the golden scale from his pocket, holding it aloft like a trophy claimed in righteous battle. "I want the same blessing he received. No, I want more. I want the power to transform not just villages but nations. I want to heal, not just individuals but entire continents." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, lies wrapped in the language of nobility but reeking of ambition and entitlement. Then the trees groaned with voices that sounded like breaking bones. Then the earth cracked beneath his feet, revealing fissures that glowed with the same golden light as the stolen scale. Then the serpent rose. It was larger now than when Traoré had freed it, coiled higher, eyes blazing with fury that made the air itself seem to catch fire. This was not the patient, sorrowful creature that had waited centuries for rescue. This was something awakened to righteous anger, every scale radiating power that made Kande's stolen treasure feel like a toy in comparison. The serpent's presence filled the clearing like floodwater, drowning everything in awareness so intense. It was almost unbearable. When it spoke, its voice didn't just resonate in Kande's bones, it seemed to rewrite them, to inscribe itself into his DNA with letters of fire and judgment. "You come not to serve," the voice thundered inside his skull, making his teeth ache and his vision blur with tears he couldn't control. "You come to take. You steal what was earned through selflessness and demand what was never promised to those who rule through fear." Kande stumbled backward, but his feet found no purchase on ground that had become liquid with divine wrath. "I earned this," he spat, holding the scale higher as if its light could protect him from the creature's judgment. "I've given my life to this nation. I've made the hard choices that weak men like Traoré could never make. I am Burkina Faso." The serpent's laughter was like thunder rolling through underground caverns, beautiful and terrible, and utterly without mercy. "You are the hunger that feeds on its own people," it replied, each word dropping like molten lead into the space between them. "You are the wound that pretends to be the healing. You speak of sacrifice while growing fat on others' suffering. You claim ownership of a land you have only poisoned." The stolen scale in Kande's hand began to change. The gentle warmth that had once comforted Traoré became searing heat that penetrated Kande's flesh like acid. He screamed but couldn't release it. The scale had fused with his palm, melting into his skin, traveling up his arm like liquid fire. He dropped to his knees as the divine artifact burned its way through his circulatory system, rewriting his biology with lessons about the true cost of stolen power. Smoke poured from his mouth with each agonized breath. His eyes rolled back, showing white like those of a sacrificial animal in its final moments. The serpent circled him once, twice, its massive body carving patterns in the earth that glowed with the same golden light, now consuming Kande from within. This was not cruelty. This was consequence, the universe restoring balance that had been disrupted by greed and ambition. Then there was light brighter than the sun. Then there was silence deeper than the void between stars. And when the clearing settled back into its ancient peace, only the baobab tree remained. Its roots a little deeper, its trunk a little wider, as if it had absorbed something and been nourished by the transformation. The faint scent of ash lingered in the air, not unpleasant, but final, like the smoke from incense burned in memory of the dead. Back in the capital, Ibrahim Traoré awoke with a start from dreams filled with golden fire and the sound of justice being served in distant places. His body was covered in sweat despite the cool night air, and his heart raced with the certainty that something significant had occurred in the spiritual realm that connected all things. The wooden box sat open on his desk, its interior empty, the velvet lining slightly singed, as if something burning hot had rested there and then departed of its own accord. But he felt no loss, no sense that something precious had been stolen from him. Instead, he experienced a deep satisfaction, the kind that comes from watching the universe correct its own imbalances without human intervention. The scale had served its purpose with him, teaching him about service and humility and the proper relationship between power and responsibility. Now it had moved on to teach someone else a different lesson entirely. He walked to the window and listened to the night sounds of his capital. Traffic humming along improved roads, generators running. In hospitals that now had reliable power, the distant laughter of young people who believed their futures held more promise than their parents had ever dared imagine. By morning, the news had broken through the usual channels that carried gossip faster than official communications. General Condé was gone, not disappeared, not arrested, not transferred to some distant posting, but simply absent from the world in a way that suggested permanence. His car had been found abandoned at the edge of Koumbia, doors standing open as if he had left in great haste or been summoned by something that couldn't wait for proper parking procedures. The driver's seat was scorched black, its leather and metal twisted by heat so intense it had left glass melted and steel softened into curves that resembled organic growth. No body was found. No blood marked the scene, only ashes that sparkled, faintly with golden flecks, and a trail of footprints that led into the forest and simply stopped, as if their maker had been lifted from the earth by invisible hands. There was no press conference called to explain Condé's disappearance. There was no official decree announcing his removal from power. There was only silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any proclamation, that communicates truths too large for words. And in that silence, the people understood with the clarity that comes from witnessing divine justice firsthand. Weeks passed. The miraculous changes that had begun in Lumbila spread like ripples across the entire nation, touching communities that had never heard of golden scales or forest serpents, but nevertheless found their circumstances mysteriously improved. Wells, that had been dry for years, began producing water. Crops flourished in soil that agricultural experts had written off as permanently degraded. Diseases that had plagued certain regions for generations simply faded away, leaving behind populations healthier than they had been in living memory. Foreign observers struggled to explain the phenomenon through conventional analysis. Economic. Models couldn't account for the sudden influx of successful initiatives. Medical researchers found no scientific basis for the widespread improvements in public health. Agricultural scientists detected no changes in soil composition or weather patterns that could explain the unprecedented harvests. But the people of Burkina Faso needed no scientific validation for what they experienced daily. They saw their children growing stronger. They watched their communities flourish. They felt hope returning to places where it had been extinct for decades. Ibrahim Traoré became a different kind of leader. Not the distant figure making pronouncements from marble platforms, but a constant presence in the villages and townships where real life happened. He traveled not in armored convoys, but in simple vehicles, often alone, always ready to listen more than he spoke. He instituted what became known as the Consultation of Roots, monthly gatherings where community leaders could speak directly to him about their needs, their dreams, their concerns. No bureaucratic intermediaries, no carefully filtered reports, just honest conversation between people who shared the same soil and the same stake in their nation's future. The program that emerged from these consultations was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of top-down development imposed by experts who had never lived in rural poverty, each province would choose its own priorities and manage its own resources, Funding would flow directly to community-selected committees, bypassing the traditional networks of corruption that had siphoned away aid for generations. International observers called it naive, unsustainable, vulnerable to the very corruption it sought to eliminate. But month after month, the results spoke for themselves. Projects completed on time and under budget, resources reaching their intended recipients. Communities taking ownership of their own development in ways that created lasting change rather than dependency. Years passed like seasons of growth and harvest. Burkina Faso transformed not into a kingdom of gold and marble, but into something more valuable, a nation where dignity had been restored to work, where children could dream of futures that extended beyond mere survival, where the word progress meant something more than foreign investment and GDP statistics. Ibrahim aged not with the bitterness that consumes most politicians, but with the quiet strength that comes from serving something larger than personal ambition. His hair silvered at the temples, lines appeared around his eyes, but his spine remained straight and his gaze clear. He had learned to carry power like water, using what was needed, sharing what was abundant, never hoarding what belonged to everyone. Each time he passed the wooden box in his quarters, he paused to bow his head, not to worship the container, or mourn the artifact it had once held, but to acknowledge what the experience had taught him about the relationship between leadership and service, between power and responsibility. The box itself had changed over the years. The wood had darkened and deepened, its grain becoming more pronounced, its carved patterns more intricate, as if the container had continued growing even after its sacred contents had departed. Sometimes, in certain light, Ibrahim could swear. He saw new designs appearing in the wood, spirals and curves that suggested serpents and roots and the eternal cycle of giving and receiving. But the real test of his transformation came not from within his own country, but from beyond its borders. International corporations, frustrated by their inability to secure the exploitative contracts they had enjoyed under previous regimes, began to pressure their home governments to intervene in Burkina Faso's affairs. The language was familiar: concerns about regional stability, threats to democratic governance, the need to protect strategic resources from falling into the wrong hands. Military advisors suggested that Traoré's growing influence represented a dangerous precedent that could inspire similar movements across Africa. Economic analysts warned that his policies of community self-determination could disrupt established trade relationships and threaten quarterly profit projections. The pressure mounted slowly but steadily. Trade agreements were quietly renegotiated to exclude Burkina Faso from favorable terms. Development loans that had been promised were suddenly subject to new conditions that would have restored the old systems of dependency and control. International media began running stories about rising authoritarianism and the suppression of opposition voices. Ibrahim watched these developments with the calm of someone who had learned to distinguish between real threats and manufactured crises. He had expected this response, had in fact been warned about it in dreams that came to him on nights when the wind carried whispers from Koumbia forest. The serpent's voice, distant but clear: "They will try to take from the outside what they could not steal from within. But remember what roots know that branches forget. True strength comes not from reaching toward the sky, but from growing deeper into the earth." One evening, as international pressure reached its peak and foreign warships began conducting training exercises uncomfortably close to West African waters, Ibrahim received an unexpected visitor. Fatou, the blind woman who had given him shelter on the night that changed everything, appeared at the palace gates. She had walked, the guards reported, over 300 kilometers from Lumbila to the capital, moving with the steady pace of someone following an internal compass that never wavered. She carried nothing but a walking stick carved from baobab, wood, and a small cloth bundle that contained her most precious possessions: a photograph of her late husband, a handful of seeds from her garden, and a letter written in Braille that she had composed but never sent. The guards wanted to turn her away. Security protocols, proper channels, the countless bureaucratic barriers that separated power from the people it was supposed to serve. But Ibrahim came down to meet her personally, dismissing the protocols with a wave of his hand. "Fatu," he said, taking her weathered hands in his own. "You've traveled so far." She smiled, her milky eyes seeming to look through him to something beyond. "Not so far. I followed the path that the trees showed me, the same path that brought you to my door all those years ago." They walked together through the palace gardens, past fountains that had been restored and flower beds that bloomed with native plants instead of imported ornamentals. She moved with the confidence of someone who saw with more than vision, her stick tapping against stones that her feet somehow knew to avoid. "The forest sent me," she said as they settled beneath a young baobab that had been planted to commemorate the nation's transformation. "Not to warn you, you already know what comes, but to remind you of what you learned in the darkness." "What did I learn?" Fatu was quiet for a long moment, her head tilted as if listening to voices that spoke in frequencies below normal human hearing. That true power grows like roots, slowly, deeply, invisibly. That the mightiest trees are not those that stretch highest toward the sky, but those that anchor deepest into the earth. She reached into her bundle and withdrew something that made Ibrahim's breath catch in his throat. Another golden scale, smaller than the first, but unmistakably from the same source, warm with the same internal light. "How?" "The serpent sheds as it grows," Fatu explained, placing the scale in his palm with ceremony befitting a sacred ritual. "What was taken by force burned the taker. What is given freely multiplies the gift. This one carries no power over others, only the strength to remain yourself when others would change you." Ibrahim closed his fingers around the scale, feeling its warmth spread through him like recognition, like coming home after a long journey through hostile territory. "They will come soon," Fatu continued, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "Those who fear what you represent, who see your success as their failure. They will bring ships and planes and the language of liberation that sounds like chains being forged." "What should I do?" Fatu stood slowly, her ancient bones creaking but her spirit unbroken. "Do what you did in the forest. Act without desire. For reward, serve without thought of gratitude. Love without requirement of love returned." She paused, her unseeing eyes somehow finding his. "And remember that some battles are won not by fighting, but by refusing to become what your enemies need you to be." The international intervention, when it came, arrived wrapped in familiar rhetoric about humanitarian concerns and democratic values. Warships positioned themselves off the coast under the pretense of joint training exercises. Diplomatic cables spoke of troubling reports about political prisoners and suppressed opposition, though no evidence of such suppression could be found by independent observers. Economic pressure intensified. Trade sanctions were imposed under emergency powers, justified by vague references to regional security threats. International banks froze assets and canceled agreements, choking off the financial flows that had sustained the nation's remarkable transformation. The old playbook was being implemented with mechanical precision: isolate the target, destabilize the economy, create conditions that would justify intervention, then install a more cooperative government that would restore the profitable status quo. But something was different this time. The communities that had learned to govern themselves didn't collapse when external funding disappeared. They adapted, innovated, found ways to continue their work using local resources and indigenous knowledge that had sustained their ancestors for millennia before foreign aid had ever existed, villages that had once competed for scarce government. Resources began sharing what they had: seeds, tools, expertise, labor. A network of mutual support emerged that was invisible to satellite surveillance, but real as the roots that connected forest trees and underground communication systems. When economic sanctions cut off access to imported fertilizers, farmers rediscovered techniques for enriching soil with composted waste and carefully managed crop rotations. When medical supplies were blocked at borders, traditional healers shared knowledge that had been dismissed as superstition but proved remarkably effective for treating common ailments. The transformation that had begun with divine intervention continued through human ingenuity and cooperation, proving more resilient than anyone had expected. Ibrahim watched these developments with pride that was tempered by awareness of what they truly represented. His people were being tested by forces that had toppled governments across the continent, and they were responding not with violence or desperation, but with the kind of quiet determination that builds civilizations. 20 years have passed since Ibrahim Traoré walked into Koumbia forest as a desperate president and emerged as something more difficult to categorize, a leader who had learned to serve, a ruler who had discovered the power of humility, a man who carried blessings he had never sought and responsibilities he would never fully escape. Burkina Faso remains transformed, though not in ways that translate easily into the language of international development reports or economic indicators. It has become a place where children grow up expecting clean water and competent medical care, where communities govern themselves with wisdom that combines ancient traditions and modern innovations, where the word politician means someone who serves rather than someone who rules. Ibrahim's hair is fully gray now, his face lined with years of honest labor and genuine concern for others' welfare. He has refused numerous opportunities to extend his term limits, instead working to strengthen the institutions that will outlast any individual leader. The wooden box in his quarters has grown more intricate over the years, its patterns more complex, its wood so deeply grained it seems to contain entire ecosystems in its microscopic depths. Sometimes visitors swear they see movement in those patterns. Serpents coiling through carved forests, roots growing deeper into wooden earth, cycles of life and death and renewal that continue without beginning or end. One day, a young journalist, the daughter of the nurse who had once treated malaria patients with nothing but prayer, asked him the question that foreign correspondents had been posing for decades. "Do you really believe in the story? The serpent? The scale? The forest magic?" Ibrahim looked at her with eyes that had seen wonders and terrors in equal measure, that had witnessed the birth of miracles and the price of hubris. His smile carried the weight of experience earned through service rather than study. "I believe," he said, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood their power to shape reality, "that when a person enters a place where truth still breathes freely, they either leave with more humanity or they don't leave at all." The world beyond Burkina Faso's borders continues to struggle with the old patterns, the cycles of exploitation and resistance, the endless pursuit of growth that devours its own foundation, the worship of power that destroys what it claims to protect. But late at night, when the capital sleeps and the dry wind stirs the tall grass beyond the city limits, a whisper moves through the trees of Koumbia. It carries no words that human language could capture, but its message is clear to those who have learned to listen with more than their ears. It speaks of patience and consequence, of gifts given and prices paid, of the eternal truth that what is planted in service will grow into blessing, while what is sown in selfishness will harvest only ash. The forest remembers, the serpent waits. And somewhere in the depths of ancient trees that have watched empires rise and fall like waves on distant shores, golden scales catch starlight and pulse with the rhythm of a heart that beats for all living things. The cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will, waiting for the next soul brave enough to enter the darkness, seeking not power over others, but the strength to serve something greater than themselves. And in villages across the Sahel, children grow up hearing stories of the president who gave away his blessing and found it multiplied beyond counting, who learned that true leadership means planting trees whose shade will comfort generations yet unborn. The golden scale still exists, though not as a single artifact locked away in palace vaults. It has become something larger, a principle, a possibility, a reminder that even in a world grown cynical and hard, there remain places where magic responds to sincere hearts and ancient wisdom flows through those humble enough to receive it. The forest has eyes, and it is watching still, patient as stone, enduring as water, eternal as the turning of seasons that brings life from death and hope from despair. Some gifts can only be earned through service. Some powers can only be wielded by those who seek no power at all. And some truths can only be learned by those brave enough to walk into the darkness, carrying nothing but love for strangers and trust in forces larger than human understanding. The serpent sleeps beneath the baobab, coiled around roots that grow deeper with each passing year, waiting for the next soul who will choose service over dominion, love over fear, roots over reaching toward a sky that cannot be grasped. The gift continues, the cycle endures, and the forest remembers everything,